The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Windsor as tourists began gathering for the daily changing of the guard ceremony. Among them stood Margaret Thornfield, a 45-year-old woman from suburban Manchester, clutching her designer handbag and wearing an expression of barely contained irritation. She had driven 3 hours with her teenage daughter Emma to witness this historic tradition, and nothing was going to ruin her perfect photo opportunity. Margaret had always been particular about getting her way. Back home, she was known for demanding to speak to managers at every establishment, returning meals that were perfectly fine, and parking wherever she pleased. Her neighbors whispered about her behind closed doors, calling her the neighborhood Karen, though never to her face. Today, however, her demanding nature would lead her into a situation she never could have imagined. As the crowd grew thicker around the castle grounds, Margaret noticed the perfect spot near the entrance gate. The area was clearly marked with barriers and signs indicating it was reserved for the ceremonial procession, but she saw only an excellent vantage point for photographs. Without hesitation, she ducked under the rope barrier and positioned herself directly in the center of the path. "Mom, I don't think we're supposed to stand here," Emma whispered, tugging at her mother's sleeve nervously. The teenager had noticed the uniformed security guards approaching and felt the disapproving stares from other tourists. "Nonsense, Emma," Margaret replied loudly, adjusting her position and pulling out her phone. "I paid good money for parking, and I'm going to get the photos I want. These barriers are just suggestions anyway." A polite security guard approached them with a friendly smile. "Excuse me, madam, but this area needs to remain clear for the ceremonial procession. The guards will be marching through here in about 10 minutes. There's excellent viewing from behind the barriers." Margaret turned to face the guard with the look she had perfected over years of demanding special treatment. "Do you know who I am? I've been planning this trip for months. I'm not moving from this spot just because you say so. I'm a taxpayer, and I have every right to stand wherever I please on public property." The security guard's smile faltered slightly, but he maintained his professional demeanor. "I understand your enthusiasm, ma'am, but for safety reasons and to preserve the ceremony's dignity, I must insist you move behind the designated viewing area." "I'm not moving anywhere," Margaret declared, crossing her arms defiantly. "You can't make me. I know my rights, and I'm not breaking any laws by standing on a public sidewalk." Other tourists began to notice the commotion. Some pulled out their phones, sensing that something interesting was about to unfold. A few tried to reason with Margaret, explaining that the ceremony was a centuries-old tradition that deserved respect, but she dismissed their concerns with waves of her hand. As the minutes ticked by, more security personnel arrived on the scene. Word had spread through their radio network that there was a situation developing along the procession route. The head of security, a veteran named Thomas, who had worked at Windsor for over 15 years, approached Margaret personally. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one final time to please move to the designated viewing area. The Queen's Guard will be arriving shortly, and they cannot deviate from their ceremonial route. This has been the same path for over 200 years, and it's not going to change today." Margaret's voice grew louder and more shrill. "I don't care if it's been 2,000 years. I'm not moving. This is public property, and you have no authority to tell me where I can and cannot stand. I want to speak to your supervisor immediately." Emma's face turned red with embarrassment as she realized dozens of people were now watching and recording her mother's outburst. She tried once more to convince her mother to step aside, but Margaret was beyond reason. In the distance, the sound of military drums began to echo off the ancient stone walls. The rhythmic beating grew steadily louder, accompanied by the precise footsteps of approaching guardsmen. The crowd behind the barriers pressed forward excitedly, cameras ready to capture the magnificent display of British military tradition. Thomas spoke into his radio, his voice calm but urgent. We have a civilian refusing to clear the ceremonial route. The Queen's Guard is approximately 2 minutes out, requesting guidance on how to proceed. The crackling response came back immediately. The ceremony proceeds as scheduled. No deviations from protocol under any circumstances. Margaret smiled smugly, interpreting the radio chatter as validation of her position. See? They're not going to cancel their little parade because of me. I'll just stay right here and get my photos. What Margaret didn't understand was that the Queen's Guard operates under strict military discipline that has been maintained for centuries. They don't simply walk around obstacles or pause for civilians. Their duty is to execute their ceremonial responsibilities with absolute precision, regardless of what stands in their way. As the first glimpse of red tunics and tall black bearskin hats appeared around the corner, the crowd erupted in excited murmurs. The guardsmen marched in perfect formation, their faces stern and focused straight ahead. Their boots struck the cobblestones with military precision, creating a thunderous rhythm that echoed through the courtyard. Margaret positioned herself directly in their path, phone held high, completely confident that they would simply march around her. She had no idea that she was about to learn a lesson about the unwavering dedication of the British Royal Guard that would change her perspective forever. The Queen's Guard continued their approach, their formation absolutely perfect. Each guardsman stared straight ahead with unwavering focus, their faces stone-cold and expressionless beneath their iconic bearskin hats. The lead guardsman, Lance Sergeant William Hayes, had been performing this ceremony for 8 years and had encountered every possible situation, but he had never seen such blatant disrespect for the ancient tradition. Margaret stood her ground, waving cheerfully at the approaching guards as if she were greeting old friends. "Emma, get ready with the camera. This is going to be perfect," she called out, completely oblivious to the gravity of the situation she had created. The crowd behind the barriers watched in stunned silence. Many had traveled from around the world to witness this ceremony, understanding its significance in British culture. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. An elderly gentleman from Japan turned to his wife and whispered, "Does she not understand what she's doing?" As the guards drew closer, their pace never wavering, Thomas, the head of security, made one final attempt. "Ma'am, please. They will not stop or go around you. This is your last chance to move to safety." Margaret laughed dismissively. "Oh, please. They're not going to walk into me. They'll just step aside for a moment." "It's not that serious." What Margaret failed to understand was that the Queen's Guard operates under centuries of military tradition. They are trained to maintain their formation and route at all costs. During their ceremonial duties, they are not permitted to break character, speak to civilians, or deviate from their assigned path for any reason. This isn't just a tourist attraction. It's a solemn military duty performed in service to the crown. The lead guardsman's boots struck the cobblestones with increasing authority as the formation approached Margaret's position. 20 feet away, 15 feet, 10 feet. The drums continued their rhythmic beating, and the crowd held its collective breath. At 5 feet away, Margaret finally began to realize that something wasn't right. The lead guard's eyes remained fixed, straight ahead, looking right through her as if she didn't exist. His expression never changed, and his pace never slowed. For the first time since this confrontation began, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Margaret's face. "Excuse me," she said, raising her voice toward the approaching guard. "I'm standing here. You need to go around me." The guardsman continued forward without acknowledgement. In the military training that had been drilled into him for years, civilians who interfered with ceremonial duties were treated as obstacles to be dealt with according to strict protocol. The guard's duty was to his queen, his regiment, and the centuries of tradition he represented. At 3 feet away, Margaret finally understood that this wasn't going to unfold the way she had imagined. The massive guardsman, standing over 6 feet tall and weighing considerably more than her, was not going to stop or step aside. Panic began to set in as she realized her mistake. "Wait! Stop! I'm a person! You can't just—" Margaret's protest was cut short as Lance Sergeant Hayes executed a textbook military maneuver. Without breaking stride or changing his expression, he continued straight forward. The impact wasn't violent or aggressive, but it was inevitable and unstoppable. Margaret found herself being gently but firmly pushed aside by the guardsman's steady advance. She stumbled backward, her phone clattering to the ground as she struggled to maintain her balance. The guard's training had taught him how to maintain formation while dealing with obstacles without causing injury, but also without compromising the ceremony. Emma rushed forward to help her mother, her face burning with shame at the spectacle they had created. The crowd erupted in a mixture of gasps, cheers, and applause. Many tourists began filming more intently, realizing they were witnessing something extraordinary. But the most surprising part was yet to come. As Margaret regained her footing and looked up at the guardsman who had just displaced her, she expected to see smugness or satisfaction. Instead, she saw something that completely caught her off guard. Lance Sergeant Hayes, while maintaining his forward movement and ceremonial posture, briefly caught her eye. In that split second, she saw not anger or disrespect, but a look of profound sadness and disappointment. It wasn't the look of a soldier who had enjoyed pushing aside a civilian, but of a man who was deeply saddened that someone would show such disrespect for something he held sacred. The entire formation continued past her without missing a beat, their precision unchanged by the incident. Each guardsman maintained perfect posture and timing, demonstrating the discipline and professionalism that had made the British military legendary around the world. As the last of the guards passed, Margaret stood there in stunned silence, her mind racing to process what had just happened. The crowd's attention had shifted back to the ceremony, but she could still hear whispers and see phones pointed in her direction. Thomas approached her again, this time with a mixture of concern and authority. "Ma'am, are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" Margaret shook her head slowly, still processing the encounter. I don't understand. Why didn't he just go around me? It would have been so simple." "Because, ma'am, what you witnessed is 400 years of military tradition. These men don't see themselves as tourist attractions. They're active duty soldiers performing a sacred duty. When you blocked their path, you weren't just inconveniencing a parade. You were interfering with a ceremony that represents honor, duty, and service to something greater than ourselves." For the first time all morning, Margaret was speechless. She looked around at the faces in the crowd, many of whom were shaking their heads in disapproval. Others looked at her with pity rather than anger, recognizing that she had genuinely not understood the significance of what she was interfering with. Emma finally spoke up, her voice quiet and embarrassed. "Mum, maybe we should go." But something had changed in Margaret's expression. The defiant anger was gone, replaced by something she hadn't felt in years, genuine remorse. As she watched the guards complete their ceremony with flawless precision, she began to understand that she had witnessed something far more important than she had realized. As the ceremony continued, Margaret found herself unable to look away from the guards' precise movements. Something about their unwavering dedication and the sadness she had glimpsed in the lead guardsman's eyes had shaken her more deeply than the physical encounter itself. For the first time in years, she felt genuinely ashamed of her behavior. The crowd around her began to disperse as the formal ceremony concluded, but Margaret remained rooted to the spot where she had been displaced. Emma tugged gently at her sleeve, eager to escape the lingering stares and whispered comments from other tourists. "Mom, can we please go now? People are still looking," Emma pleaded quietly. But Margaret seemed lost in thought, watching as the guards completed their final maneuvers and began to return to their posts. She noticed details she had missed before: the careful maintenance of their uniforms, the pride in their bearing, the respect they showed for each other, and the ceremony itself. Thomas, who had been observing her reaction, approached once more. His stern expression had softened somewhat, recognizing that something had shifted in the woman who had been so defiant just minutes earlier. "Ma'am, I can see you're upset. I want you to know that incidents like this happen more often than you might think. Many visitors don't fully understand the significance of what they're witnessing." Margaret turned to face him, her eyes glistening with unexpected tears. "I had no idea," she admitted quietly. "I thought it was just a show for tourists. I didn't realize it meant so much to them." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "These men aren't actors or performers, ma'am. They're active duty soldiers who have earned the honor of serving in the Queen's Guard through years of dedicated service. For many of them, this duty represents the pinnacle of their military career." As they spoke, Margaret noticed Lance Sergeant Hayes in the distance, now stationary at his post. Even from afar, she could see the same dignified bearing that had impressed her so much during the encounter. An idea began forming in her mind, one that surprised her with its clarity. Is there any way I could speak to him?" Margaret asked hesitantly. "The guardsman I interfered with? I think I owe him an apology." Thomas looked surprised by the request. "Well, that's not typically possible during their duty hours. The guards aren't permitted to break character or engage with civilians while on ceremonial duty. However," he paused, considering, "his shift ends in about 2 hours. If you're willing to wait, I might be able to arrange something informal." Margaret nodded immediately. "Yes, I'll wait. I need to make this right." Emma looked at her mother with amazement. She had never seen her mother admit she was wrong about anything, let alone offer to apologize to a stranger. "Are you sure about this, Mom?" "Emma, I've been acting like an entitled fool all morning," Margaret said, her voice heavy with regret. "That man was doing his job, honoring his duty, and I treated it like it was all about me. The least I can do is acknowledge that properly." As they waited, Thomas took the opportunity to educate Margaret about the history and significance of the Queen's Guard. He explained how guardsmen are selected from elite regiments, how they train for months to achieve the precision she had witnessed, and how the ceremony she had interrupted dated back to the 1600s. "Each guardsman takes an oath," Thomas explained. "They swear to carry out their duties with honor and dignity, regardless of circumstances. What you experienced today wasn't personal. It was the result of centuries of military discipline and tradition." Margaret listened intently, feeling her shame deepen with each detail she learned. She began to understand that her actions hadn't just inconvenienced a parade. She had disrespected something sacred to these men and to British culture itself. During the wait, something unexpected happened. Several tourists who had witnessed the earlier incident approached Margaret. Instead of criticism, many offered understanding and shared their own stories of cultural misunderstandings while traveling. An elderly American veteran introduced himself as Robert. "Ma'am, I served in Vietnam, and I understand what those boys feel about duty and honor. The fact that you're waiting here to apologize tells me everything I need to know about your character." A young woman from Australia added, "I made a similar mistake at a war memorial in France last year. Sometimes we don't realize how important these traditions are until we see them up close." These conversations helped Margaret realize that her experience, while embarrassing, was also an opportunity for growth and understanding. She began to see the day not as a humiliation, but as a chance to learn something valuable about respect, tradition, and humility. When Lance Sergeant Hayes finally completed his duty and changed out of his ceremonial uniform, Thomas approached him privately to explain the situation. The guardsman's initial response was one of wariness. Confrontations with difficult civilians were an unfortunate but regular part of his job. However, when Thomas explained that the woman was waiting specifically to apologize and had spent 2 hours learning about the significance of his duties, Hayes agreed to a brief meeting. Margaret's heart raced as she saw the guardsman approaching in civilian clothes. Without his uniform and ceremonial bearing, he looked younger than she had expected, probably in his early 30s, with kind eyes and a slight smile. "Ma'am, I understand you wanted to speak with me," he said politely, extending his hand. "I'm William Hayes." Margaret shook his hand, surprised by his gentle demeanor. "Mr. Hayes, I'm Margaret Thornfield, and I owe you a sincere apology. I behaved terribly this morning, and I'm deeply sorry." What happened next surprised everyone, including Margaret herself. Instead of simply accepting her apology and moving on, William did something that would change her perspective on service, duty, and human kindness forever. William Hayes studied Margaret's face for a moment, seeing genuine remorse in her eyes. Instead of simply accepting her apology and walking away, he surprised everyone by saying, "Mrs. Thornfield, would you mind if we sat down for a few minutes? I'd like to share something with you." They found a nearby bench, and William began to speak in a voice that was both gentle and passionate. "Mrs. Thornfield, I want you to know that what happened today wasn't about you personally, but I think there's something you should understand about why we do what we do." Margaret nodded, hanging on every word. "I joined the army when I was 18, William continued. "My father died when I was young, and my mother raised 3 children on her own. The military gave me purpose, discipline, and a chance to serve something bigger than myself. When I was selected for the Queen's Guard, it was the proudest moment of my life." He paused, looking toward the castle. "Every morning when I put on that uniform, I'm not just representing myself. I'm honoring my father's memory, my mother's sacrifices, and hundreds of years of men who stood in formation before me. Some of them died for the values we represent: duty, honor, service to others." Margaret felt tears forming in her eyes as she began to understand the depth of meaning behind what she had dismissed as mere pageantry. "When you stood in our path today," William said gently, "it wasn't just about a photo opportunity. For us, maintaining that formation represents our commitment to never abandon our duty, no matter what obstacles we face. It's a promise we made to our country and to each other." Emma, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "We had no idea it meant so much. We just thought it was a tourist thing." William smiled kindly at the teenager. "That's understandable. But here's what I want you both to know. What you did this afternoon took real courage. You waited 2 hours to apologize to someone you'd never met because you realized you had made a mistake. That shows character." Margaret was crying openly now. "I've been thinking about that moment when you looked at me. You looked so sad, not angry. Why?" "Because," William said quietly, "I could see that you didn't understand what you were interfering with. It made me sad to think that something I find so meaningful might appear worthless to others. But now I see I was wrong about you." What William did next shocked Margaret to her core. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small military coin, the kind given to recognize exceptional service or to honor special occasions. "Mrs. Thornfield, I want to give you this. It's a regimental coin from my unit. I've been carrying it for 3 years, waiting for the right moment to give it to someone special." Margaret stared at the coin in disbelief. "I can't accept this. I was horrible to you today." "You made a mistake," William corrected gently. "But then you chose to learn, to wait, and to make it right. That takes humility and strength. More importantly, you've helped me remember why I love what I do." Thomas, who had been watching the conversation from a distance, approached with something in his hand. "Mrs. Thornfield, I've been working here for 15 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this. Would you be interested in taking a proper tour of the castle? I'd like to show you some of the history behind what you witnessed today. Margaret looked at her daughter, then back at William and Thomas. I would be honored. Over the next 2 hours, Thomas gave Margaret and Emma a private tour that most tourists never experience. They saw the quarters where the guards prepare for duty, learned about the specific regiments represented, and heard stories of individual guardsmen who had served with distinction. In the Regimental Museum, Margaret learned about guards who had served in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other conflicts around the world. She realized that the ceremonial duties she had witnessed were performed by men who had faced real combat and genuine danger in service of their country. These aren't just ceremonial soldiers, Thomas explained as they viewed displays of medals and commendations. Many of our guardsmen are veterans of active combat deployments. The ceremony you saw today is their way of honoring fallen comrades and maintaining the traditions that give meaning to their service. By the end of the tour, Margaret was a changed woman. She understood that her encounter with the Queen's Guard had been about much more than a blocked path or a missed photo opportunity. It had been a collision between her self-centered worldview and the profound dedication of people who had chosen to serve something greater than themselves. As they prepared to leave, William appeared once more. Mrs. Thornfield, I have one more surprise for you. He led them to a spot overlooking the parade ground where the ceremony had taken place earlier. Tomorrow morning, the ceremony happens again. If you'd like to come back, I'd be honored to have you watch from the official viewing area. You'll have a perfect view, and you'll understand what you're seeing. Margaret was speechless. After treating him so poorly, this young man was extending genuine kindness and friendship. William, she said, using his first name for the first time, I'll be here, and I promise you'll see a very different Margaret Thornfield. The next morning, Margaret and Emma returned to Windsor Castle. They arrived early and positioned themselves behind the barriers in the designated viewing area. When the ceremony began, Margaret watched with new eyes. She saw not just a tourist attraction, but a living connection to history. She understood the precision as a demonstration of discipline and commitment. When Lance Sergeant Hayes led his formation past their viewing point, he caught her eye and gave the slightest nod of acknowledgement. After the ceremony, Margaret did something that surprised everyone who knew her. She began volunteering as a guide for confused tourists, helping them understand the significance of what they were witnessing. She became known among the security staff as the woman who helped prevent incidents like her own. 6 months later, Margaret received an invitation that brought tears to her eyes. William Hayes was being promoted to color sergeant, and he had invited her to attend the ceremony. In her acceptance letter, she wrote, "Thank you for teaching me that true strength comes not from demanding our own way, but from serving something greater than ourselves." The selfish woman who had blocked the Royal Guard's formation that morning had been transformed by an encounter with genuine service and sacrifice. She had learned that sometimes the most important lessons come not from getting our own way, but from understanding why others choose a different path entirely.